I found proof my twin brother was stealing my life. For almost a year. Reality kept slipping sideways in ways I couldn't explain. It started small. A barista at the cafe near my apartment smiled too brightly and asked if I wanted the usual. Then looked confused when I ordered something different. A coworker laughed about a joke I didn't remember telling. A neighbor gave me a cold look that felt earned, even though I couldn't imagine why. I told myself what anyone would: stress. Burnout? Maybe I was more forgetful than I wanted to admit. Then, Eden asked me why I had stopped caring. That sentence landed harder than anything else. Eden had been in my life for 3 years by then. She was steady, observant, and frustratingly perceptive. She noticed changes before I did, and she noticed when I was technically present, but emotionally elsewhere. She said I had become colder and less patient. She said I kept canceling plans I didn't remember making. The worst part was that I couldn't argue with her. Not because she was right, but because I had no evidence she was wrong. I apologized and promised to do better. I started tracking everything more carefully. That's when the real problems began. I found emails I didn't remember sending. Polite but distant messages to Eden that sounded like me, but not enough like me. Texts to coworkers agreeing to things I never showed up for. A charge on my credit card from a store I hadn't visited in years. Every time I confronted someone, the answer was the same. You told me already? You were here? You said it yourself. There was never malice in their voices. Just certainty. I started wondering if I was dissociating or blacking out or something. I made a doctor's appointment and cancelled it twice without remembering either time. The night everything shifted was ordinary in the most insulting way. I came home early from work, exhausted, planning to cook dinner with Eden. I unlocked my door and walked straight into the sound of my own voice. It was coming from my living room. I froze. For a split second, I genuinely believed I was hearing an echo, or a recording, or something reasonable my brain could latch onto. Then I saw movement through the doorway. Someone was sitting on my couch as Eden got up to go to the bathroom. I stepped forward before logic caught up, and that's when he turned his head. He had my face. The same scar at the edge of his eyebrow. The same crooked nose from when we were kids. The same posture I'd been trying to correct for years. He stood up slowly, like this was expected. Eden asked what was wrong from around the corner. The world narrowed into something tight and ringing. I remember noticing how calm he looked. However, I don't remember what Eden said, or if she screamed or froze or spoke at all. I left my apartment without grabbing anything. I didn't say goodbye. I didn't look back. I walked for almost 2 hours before my phone buzzed with a message from Sydney asking me where I went and why I was being dramatic. I hadn't seen my twin brother in over a decade. That fact alone should have made everything clearer sooner. His name is Daniel. We are identical twins, but that was never where the similarities ended. Growing up, he learned early that people listened to him more easily, trusted him faster, and believed him without proof. Where I was methodical, Daniel was instinctive. Where I hesitated, he acted. Where I questioned consequences, he treated them like inconveniences. By the time we were 18, he had already learned how to slide into my life when it suited him, and how to vanish when things went wrong. The last time I saw him, he had borrowed money from our parents using my name and left me to clean up the fallout. That was the final fracture. I cut contact, changed my number, and moved cities. I thought distance would be enough, but I was starting to learn how wrong I was. After the apartment incident, I started digging. I checked security cameras in my building and felt my stomach drop as footage confirmed what my mind resisted. Someone, with my face, had been entering and leaving my apartment while I was at work. Sometimes for minutes, sometimes for hours. He knew my schedule and my routines. He knew enough to blend in. I reviewed months of footage and saw the gradual escalation. First the lobby, then the elevator, then my floor, then my door. The timestamps lined up perfectly with the gaps in my memory. These were all of the moments people swore they'd seen me when I knew I hadn't been there. Daniel wasn't just impersonating me. He was editing me. The most painful discoveries involved Ethan. Messages were sent from my phone while I was asleep with subtle shifts in tone. Affection was mixed with withdrawal, and apologies were sent for arguments I never had. Boundaries were pushed, then reframed as mutual decisions. He wasn't trying to steal her outright. He was trying to make me unrecognizable to her. I realized. That's what made this so effective. Daniel didn't need to replace me completely. He just needed to erode trust until I looked unstable, unreliable, volatile. And it worked. When I finally told Eden the truth, or at least my version of it, her face closed off in that polite, careful way people use when they're humoring someone. She said stress can do strange things to memory, and maybe it was easier to blame an imaginary evil twin than admit I was struggling. Daniel had already laid the groundwork. I stopped trying to convince her and focused instead on learning everything about what Daniel was doing. The more I uncovered, the clearer his pattern became. He only showed up when I had something stable, like a job I liked, a relationship built on trust, and a reputation for reliability. Daniel didn't want my life because it was better than his. He wanted it because it was mine. And because he knew exactly how to ruin it without anyone noticing until it was too late. Once I accepted that Daniel was deliberately dismantling my life, something in me hardened. Fear stopped being useful, and confusion stopped being productive. If Daniel wanted chaos, I would give him structure. If he wanted to erase me, I would document every place I still existed. I stopped reacting publicly, showed up to work early, and left late. I answered emails with excessive clarity. I followed up every conversation with written confirmation. I started wearing a cheap fitness tracker. Not for health, but for timestamps. If I was asleep, I wanted proof. If I was at my desk, I wanted evidence. I installed a second camera in my apartment, hidden and angled only toward the door. I stopped using my phone for personal messages and switched Eden's contact to email only, knowing Daniel favored quick, informal channels. I let him think he was winning because he was getting bolder. Daniel stopped sneaking in during the day and started showing up at night. Sometimes I'd see him enter on camera just minutes after I left the building. Sometimes he stayed long enough to shower. Once, he slept in my bed. He didn't steal anything obvious. What he took instead was familiarity. He touched my things like they belonged to him. He wore my clothes and rearranged small objects just enough that I noticed but couldn't prove tampering. It was psychological graffiti. Meanwhile, my reputation began to fracture. At work, I was pulled aside and gently warned about tone. Apparently, I had spoken sharply to a junior colleague the week before. Apparently, I had dismissed feedback during a meeting I attended. But not in the way they described. I asked for dates and times, and they gave them confidently. Footage. Daniel had been there, wearing my jacket, and using my access badge. Security logs confirmed it. HR didn't care. They told me badge sharing was a serious violation. They told me impersonation claims were extreme, and that stress can manifest in unpredictable ways. They ended up putting a note in my file. Meanwhile, Eden stopped replying altogether. I didn't chase her. I knew anything emotional I sent could be twisted. Instead, I sent one message, long and meticulously detailed. I attached screenshots, timestamps, and video stills. I explained Daniel without villainizing him, and framed it like a logistical problem rather than a betrayal. She replied 2 days later saying she needed space. She said the evidence was concerning but also overwhelming. She said she couldn't tell which version of me was real anymore. That sentence was exactly what Daniel wanted. I realized then that this wasn't about replacing me in any single role. It was about splitting me into contradictions until no one could assemble the whole picture. Daniel was careful never to commit crimes big enough to trigger immediate action. No theft large enough for police. No violence or threats. Just identity erosion and death by administrative indifference. I consulted a lawyer. He listened politely, reviewed my evidence, and told me the truth in the flattest voice imaginable. Identical twins make these cases nearly impossible. Unless Daniel confessed, or unless I could prove simultaneous presence in 2 places at once, everything would be treated as a dispute between relatives. At best, I could pursue a restraining order. At worst, I'd look unstable on record. I chose not to pursue it. Instead, I watched Daniel began making mistakes. He stayed longer in places where people recognized me well. He slipped into habits that weren't his, and overplayed familiarity with colleagues who knew my boundaries. He misremembered details I would never forget. They were all small things, but small things add up. The break came from a place I didn't expect, my parents. They called me one evening, confused and hurt, asking why I had asked them for money again. I hadn't, Daniel had. This time, though, he'd miscalculated. He used an account I hadn't touched in years, one that required voice verification. My parents had recorded the call, and they sent it to me. I listened to my brother speaking with my voice, my cadence, and my name, asking for help, like it was owed to him. And for the first time, I felt something close to relief, because now, I wasn't alone. My parents recognized the difference. They heard the subtle aggression beneath the politeness and the entitlement I never carried. They told me they'd suspected something was wrong for months, but hadn't known how to say it. Daniel had underestimated them. He assumed everyone saw me the way he did. As interchangeable. I started coordinating quietly and sharing evidence selectively. I was building a timeline that didn't rely on emotion or accusation. By the time Daniel realized the ground was shifting, I had already set the trap. He just didn't know it yet. Once my parents were involved, the rules changed. Not because they confronted Daniel directly, they were too careful for that, but because they became witnesses who couldn't be dismissed as confused co-workers or emotionally compromised partners. They remembered things I had forgotten. Missed. Birthdays I was blamed for, arguments I supposedly started, and requests for money that never made sense. They knew about all of the moments over the years when Daniel had appeared briefly, caused damage, and vanished again. They had always assumed it was me trying to clean up after him. Now they understood the opposite had been happening. We agreed on one rule immediately: no confrontation, no warnings, and no emotional appeals. Daniel thrived on reaction. What he hated was being ignored while systems closed around him. I took a leave of absence from work. Officially, it was for stress. Unofficially, it was to remove myself as a variable. If Daniel wanted to keep impersonating me, I wanted the contrast to become undeniable. I changed my routines completely. New hours, new locations, and new clothes. I let my beard grow in unevenly, and I stopped correcting my posture. I leaned into being slightly different in ways only people who knew me well would notice. Daniel didn't adjust. He kept playing the old version of me. That's how people started noticing inconsistencies. I received forwarded emails from colleagues asking if everything was okay because I had apparently apologized to them twice for the same incident. I heard from a former supervisor who asked why I was suddenly interested in a role I had explicitly turned down months earlier. I responded to everything calmly, attaching timestamps and clarifying facts without accusation. Some people didn't respond, while others quietly thanked me. Meanwhile, Eden broke her silence. She didn't apologize, but she sent a long message explaining that she had started noticing gaps in conversations she remembered vividly that I had no memory of. She said she felt like she had been dating two overlapping versions of the same person. I sent her everything, and she didn't reply again for a week. When she did, it was brief. She said she believed me, but belief didn't undo damage. Daniel escalated once he sensed he was losing narrative control. He tried to force a reaction by emailing my workplace, accusing me of identity theft. He contacted Eden and sounded as if I was attempting to manipulate her with doctored footage. He reached out to mutual acquaintances and framed himself as the real me. That move backfired. Unlike me, Daniel didn't know how to stop talking. He contradicted himself. He reused explanations that didn't fit timelines. And he told different versions of the same story to different people and assumed they wouldn't compare notes. The turning point came during a routine background check. Daniel had applied for a lease under my name and used my credit history and my employment record. But he'd slipped up and used an address I'd never lived at and a reference who only knew him. The property manager contacted my employer to verify information, was still technically on leave. The discrepancy triggered an internal review. This time, HR didn't dismiss it. They asked for documentation, and I gave them everything. They brought in legal counsel and suspended my badge. Not as punishment, but as containment. Daniel had lost access, and that's when he started panicking. Showed up at my parents' house, but they didn't let him in. He left angry voicemails, demanding explanations, threatening legal action, and accusing me of turning everyone against him, as if it wasn't exactly what he was doing to me. Those messages were recorded and added to the archive. Eden finally asked to meet. We chose a public place. She didn't cry or yell. She asked questions and listened to answers. She told me about moments I'd never known existed. Arguments that ended in silence, subtle pressure disguised as concern, and decisions she thought were mutual that I'd never agreed to. We didn't resolve anything that day, but we aligned. She agreed to one thing only. If Daniel contacted her again, she would not respond. She would document everything and forward it to me. He reached out to her repeatedly, each message more insistent than the last, each one framed as concern. Eden forwarded them all to me. By the time the cease and desist letter was sent, Daniel had already violated it 3 times. That's when the police finally got involved, not for impersonation, but for harassment and fraud. It was exactly the kind of ending Daniel never planned for. Because, for the first time, the system wasn't listening to who sounded more convincing. It was listening to what could be proven. And I had been collecting proof for months. That was the difference between how he imagined consequences and how they actually arrived. There were no shouting matches, no dramatic arrests in public spaces, and no moments where everyone suddenly turned and stared. Instead, doors stopped opening, emails went unanswered, calls were returned with vague delays, and accounts froze one by one, applications stalled, and his name stopped moving forward in systems that relied on trust. He noticed before anyone else said anything. I knew this because his behavior shifted again. The messages Eden forwarded changed tone. The certainty drained. Out of them, where he had once framed himself as protective and calm, He now sounded desperate without admitting it. He repeated himself, contradicted previous explanations, and tried to reset conversations that were already documented. He wanted people to forget, but forgetting requires silence, and silence was no longer an option. The Freud investigation moved slowly, but it moved. Financial institutions don't care about family dynamics or psychological nuance. They care about patterns, signatures, IP addresses, and usage overlap. Daniel had reused too much of my life, too many times. The police interviewed me twice. Both times were uneventful. They asked procedural questions, and I answered carefully. I didn't speculate. I let the documentation speak for itself. Daniel, on the other hand, talked a lot. He insisted on explaining context and clarifying misunderstandings. That hadn't been alleged. That alone told them everything they needed to know. The final push came from a place that felt almost anticlimactic: a routine court filing. Daniel had tried to contest one of the account freezes, claiming mistaken identity. In doing so, he submitted a sworn statement, placing himself at a location where it had incontrovertible proof of being present at the same time. Two identical men in two different places. That contradiction forced escalation. What followed wasn't dramatic. Charges expanded, conditions were imposed, and contact restrictions became enforceable instead of advisory. Daniel was no longer allowed to approach my residence, my workplace, or Eden. Violations would carry consequences. For the first time, the threat didn't come from me. It came from systems Daniel couldn't charm. Eden and I spoke again after that, not to reconcile or revisit what was lost, but to acknowledge what had happened without distortion. She told me something that reframed everything. She said the reason she'd struggled to believe me at first wasn't because the evidence was weak. It was because Daniel never felt dangerous. He felt reasonable. That was the most unsettling thing about him. He nudged reality just enough that people questioned themselves instead of him. By the time the court date arrived, there was nothing theatrical left. Daniel sat across the room, no longer calm or confident. He avoided my eyes. Not out of shame, but calculation, as if still searching for leverage that no longer existed. I didn't look at him at all. The ruling didn't end his life, it ended his access to mine. That was enough for me. Life didn't snap back into place once Daniel was gone. It reassembled slowly, like a city after a prolonged blackout. Some systems restarted immediately, while others needed recalibration. A few never came back at all. Work reinstated me after their review concluded. The note in my file was removed, and quiet apologies followed. Trust returned incrementally, but Eden didn't, and I didn't expect her to. What Daniel had done couldn't be undone by proof alone. He had lived between us, and rewritten moments we would never fully separate from his interference. I understood why she would feel uneasy around me. We parted without bitterness. The most unexpected shift came internally. For months, I had existed in reaction mode. Once that pressure lifted, I had to relearn who I was without surveillance shaping my days. I stopped tracking everything, and I stopped checking cameras obsessively. Occasionally, someone would still ask if I had been somewhere I hadn't. Old habits die slowly. But now, when that happened, there was no panic, just clarity. My parents aged visibly through the process, but they also found peace in understanding the past. Years of confusion suddenly had shape. Apologies were exchanged that no one realized were overdue. We talked about boundaries more than blame. The last time I heard about Daniel was through a legal notice, confirming compliance with the contact order. I don't know if he ever understood why he failed. If I had to guess, I'd say Daniel believed identity was something you could borrow indefinitely as long as you wore it convincingly. But reality keeps receipts, and eventually, it asks for them. I still have my face, my name, and my life. Not because I fought louder than my twin, but because I stayed consistent when he couldn't. And that was the one thing he never learned how to imitate.